I'm really excited today to be joined by Andrea, and we're going to talk about plastics recycling. So, Andrea, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself and your role in experience in plastics recycling?
Of course. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I am very excited for this discussion. So, as I said, my name is Andrea. I am essentially an analyst with a really deep passion for sustainability that can be both social and environmental. But currently, I am the Americas regional lead and senior analyst at ICIS. And what we really do is we focus specifically on recycled markets, specifically plastic recycled markets, and just trying to figure out what the market trends are so that we can help our clients move towards a more circular economy. Maybe a little bit about myself. I'm currently in California, originally from Italy, and was lucky enough to meet Mel at Fair Trade USA during my first job out of college.
Yeah, absolutely. But I feel like you've gone and done so many cool things since then. But it's super interesting. I feel like the recycling system is something that a lot of people don't understand. And so I definitely want to know a little bit more about what a recycled plastics analyst does or what that means. But maybe just a couple things to share before we dive into that. I think some interesting thing that I learned recently is that the global demand for plastics has quadrupled in the last 40 years. And what I find even more interesting is that plastic gets a super bad rap and maybe not for the right reasons. So I think there's a lot of focus on end of life. But in reality, I learned that the carbon footprint from producing plastics is really from the initial phase, so that production. So maybe you don't know this, but plastics are majority from resins that come from petroleum. And not only just the extraction of the petroleum to make the resins, but also the processing and the energy that is required to melt and smelt. And smelting is metal. That is not the right thing here. But to make the plastics themselves is the majority of that footprint. And I saw an interesting fact that talked about how just from production and incineration, that is 56 billion tons of carbon, CO2, and that's equal to 50 times the annual emissions of all coal power plants in the US, which is pretty crazy to me because, again, I feel like most of the focus is on that end of life and the incineration, things. So yeah, now that we have a little bit of context on the carbon context of plastics, could you tell me a little bit more about the recycled plastic system? Because I feel like you really know a lot and most people don't.
Yeah, of course. All the statistics that you just pulled out, those are incredible. I don't think we realize how few people actually know that plastics come from petroleum.
I know, right?
And look, plastics, we can't deny the fact that the usage of plastics is only going to increase and that demand is going to continue increasing because they do provide some really great solutions, especially on the transportation side. So what I love about my role is that, okay, we know this is happening. Now, how can we increase that circularity and reduce those emissions on that front end? So that's really been a huge focus for us. But going back to kind of these recycled markets and how they work, I really want to simplify it. I think I really want to start with the sources of that waste. So we have sort of two categories, one of them being post-consumer waste and the other one being post-industrial waste. So post-consumer waste is just what are me and you using that water bottle, that candy wrap, whatever it is, and where's that going? So is it going in the recycling bin or is it going in your trash bin? And so from there, if it goes in the recycling bin, it's then collected and brought to a material recovery facility, also called a MRF. And that's
Mm.
essentially where they throw it on a line and they have either people picking through it or they have machines. And so you're going to separate the glass, the paper, the aluminum, and the plastic. And then from there, all the plastic gets taken, separated by type of plastic, and put in bales. And then those bales are purchased by the recycler. The recycler will then cut it up, wash it, and make pellets out of it. And then those pellets are then sold to a packaging manufacturer. So that's a very simple process from consumer to packaging, essentially. And then on the post-industrial side, the definition there is a little different. It's essentially what's coming off of that production line, but that's never really touching a consumer. So let's say you're trying to make a plastic chair and you cut it out of this, plastic square. Those little edges that are left over, those can't really be used again in that production line. So what are we going to do with it? Could send it to the landfill, that would just be wasted, or you could recycle it. And that waste is actually going to be cleaner because there's a lot less contaminants. So the yields are going to be higher. You can establish much more direct and constant agreements between that production line and the recycler. And so that's a great source of waste. However, a lot of the brand commitments and regulation are predominantly focused on post-consumer waste. And that's going to be just because me and you see that waste on the floor, that's what we want to tackle. It's not
Yeah.
necessarily tackling the industrial side. So I can really nerd out all day. I think one really big misconception that I just wanted to know in this process of recycling is we often think of the ones, the twos, and the fours and the fives being recycled, and that's going to be that little number that defines essentially what polymer it is. Truth is, all of them can be recycled. It's more of a question of, is there an end market for these? And so we're seeing pretty strong, actually very strong end markets for the ones, which are going to be PET, so it's going to be your clear water bottle. Somewhat strong markets for the HDPEs, so like your milk jug, it's a little milky color. And for all the other ones, as long as there's a market, it's going to get recycled. So if you as a consumer put it in that bin, it's not that it can't be possibly recycled. It's just right now there isn't an end market, but we need to continue making sure that those any type of plastic is going from the consumer to a recovery facility. I think that's really important. So hopefully that gives a brief description of all of the plastic recycled supply chain and such.
Yeah, that was a super helpful overview. And I think that me amongst, not recently realizing that those numbers actually had a significance, I was just like, cool, it tells me what to recycle. I thought that's what its purpose was. And then I realized that it was the different polymers that it actually represented. I think you bring up a couple really interesting things, mostly because I feel like there is this focus on post-consumer waste. And I feel like, some people might have heard of the term PCR. And would you call those synonymous, post-consumer waste and PCR?
Yeah, essentially, PCR is most commonly referred to the final product that's going into making something
Gotcha.
new, versus post-consumer waste would be kind of the waste side, and then PCR would be when that waste is processed, repelletized,
Into
then
something
going
new.
into something new. But essentially,
Gotcha.
yes, it's just a cleaner form of the same thing.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think it's also super interesting. I saw another statistic that said that over 90% of plastic goes unrecycled. And it sounds like there's this huge opportunity in that post-industrial recycling where you would have a cleaner thing to pelletize. And also there's, a lot accessible. So it really has a lot of potential. And so could you talk a little bit about what actually drives recycling? It sounds like this end market is really important, but like, I'm just a normal person. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really ended up breaking it down sort of the three biggest drivers. One of them being price, that's always at the top of mind for everyone. The other
Of
one
course.
being consumer demand / brand demands, and then legislation. I think those can be ordered differently depending on what market you are looking at. So maybe focusing on the United States, price is just going to be at the top right now. So just what is the price of that material? Is it way higher than virgin? If it is, then why would a brand switch to a recycled product and end up spending a lot more money to make their packaging? The answer to that would be because there's consumers that want it and brand commitments out there or legislation. But the problem comes in when in a place like the United States, legislation is almost non-existent. There are some very strong states. You have California, Maine, Colorado that have a lot of legislation. So that's going to be strong there. But at the federal level, there is zero regulation, and then there's still a lot of states that produce a lot of waste that aren't recycling anything. So if that legislation isn't forcing manufacturers to really introduce more post-consumer content into their packaging, then they're not going to do it if that price is way too high. The moment that price drops below virgin, you'll see them switch like that. It's always going to end up reverting back to that price. And so then the other thing is consumer demand and brand commitments. So those are going to be things like the US Plastic Pact or the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Those are aspirations, they're goals. You see a lot of brands really with the best intentions trying to meet these goals. But then it comes down to, again, if the price is too high and that commitment, there isn't a fine if you don't meet it. We're seeing a lot of brands, especially right now, pushing back a lot of what they had promised that they were supposed to achieve in 2025. 2025 was supposed to be a really big year. And the economy has been difficult. 2023 and 2024 were very hard in the recycling markets. And so those prices were really high. So we've seen a lot of delay. However, just thinking about, okay, price, brand demand, and legislation. Legislation is always going to be optimal. You see Europe with really strong legislation around plastic recycling. Their demand is very strong. They're even struggling on the supply side. So just focusing on those three main factors is really what's going to be driving, or unfortunately, maybe not driving these markets.
Yeah, I mean, it seems so like evident or like easy, but then I know that implementing things like policy can take years or decades, and it takes a long time to really lay down. But I know that there's a lot of legislation, especially on the West Coast, that I do think is starting to really pick up, or in Maine, as you highlighted, around what brands are responsible for, and that could really drive a lot of things. Yeah, thinking so that's kind of what builds the market. What are some of the challenges to actually recycling plastics or to having that recycled content getting into the stream? Because I think one thing that's interesting to think about is, right, we kind of have two paths, or I should say there's three paths, right? It gets recycled, it gets incinerated, or it just chills in a landfill. And I think one of the things about incineration that like catches my attention is not only is it like disastrously noxious in terms of like, you know, being next to it on the first day, but all the communities that are right nearby it, right? They have those long-term health impacts, and things like asthma or any other kind of breathing difficulty is really common because of that, what's called black carbon that's coming up as you're actually burning all that stuff. And that also has a huge climate impact as well. And so thinking about trying to push people towards recycling to avoid that, what's really the holdup in your opinion?
Where do I start with a very long list? I think there's sort of two, let's go with three main categories, two being on the front end. So in, that way, dealing with that waste, and then one of them being on that incineration topic. So on the front end, collection and sortation are a huge issue. Main reason being is that that waste just isn't making it to these MRFs where they would sort for it. I think the latest statistic by the EPA was something like 85% of all plastic waste just isn't even making it to a place where it could be picked out. It's just going directly to a landfill. So
Oh, wow.
that all needs to be recovered first of all. And if we're not recovering that, then supply is really tight, and then these prices are being driven up. So put that very simply. And this is one of those unfortunate moments where you say, well, the consumer needs to do better at sorting. Sure, the consumer does and can, but also we need to educate the consumer and blah, blah, blah. So we can't just point the finger at the consumer. However, it does very much lie with the consumer at the moment. And then the second thing being on the redesign of some of this packaging. And so there's been a lot of pressure to use some of this recycled material to make these packaging that was originally made with virgin material, and the properties just aren't the same. So this is all going to depend on the polymer type, color, etc. But in general, some recycled material tends to be a little more brittle. The integrity isn't quite the same. The colors are very difficult to predict just because you don't know what's coming in your waste stream. And so nobody at the brand level or at the packaging manufacturing level has really sat down to say, all right, this is the material that we have. How do we redesign our packaging to meet a lot of these needs? And so everyone's very picky with the pellets that are coming in, and everybody only wants that very clear, really strong PET. And so everybody's fighting over an extremely limited supply, when the case is they could be using other types of recycled content. They just haven't thought about or invested in the R&D on how to expand or change their packaging to meet that. So that's two of the big things on the front end. And then on the back end, mechanical recycling, advanced recycling, / chemical recycling, both of those provide solutions to different problems. And chemical recycling is now being targeted as incineration and as a pollutant and as a process that's really heavy on the greenhouse gas emissions, when the reality is a lot of the technologies still need to prove themselves, and a lot of LCAs, so life cycle assessments, need to be done to make sure that those greenhouse gas emissions aren't higher than the production of virgin. But if you're not allowing for the recycling or for advanced recycling, then you're just encouraging more virgin production, and more packaging and more material is going to be out there and go to the landfill. So it's a really tricky dynamic, and you have to give and take where you can. But right now, chemical recycling is really being targeted as an evil, big monster. The situation is it provides a fantastic solution for recycling. Does it still need to prove itself? Yes, and we're going through that. The market right now in chemical recycling is changing super rapidly, and a lot of processes are being filtered out exactly for the reason, but there are some that have lower greenhouse gas emissions. They provide for an excellent solution in dealing with a lot of plastic waste, and they provide the product, which is not pellets, is going to be either pie oil or whatever, is a virgin-like quality, which means that you can make anything from that oil, which is fantastic because you're reintroducing that. And so there goes the circular economy without having to compromise on your quality or your food safety. So maybe I'm getting too into the nitty gritty, but it's always going to be a game of give and take. I don't think anything around plastics is going to be a perfect solution.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And your passion is palpable, and I appreciate all the extra color that you're adding. I think, it's a really interesting conversation because I feel like most people are super quick to say, oh, switch to aluminum or switch to glass, but it's not that straightforward because you even brought up the logistics piece. Plastic has gotten to where it is because it's so light. And once you get into the transportation, carbon footprint and all the things that are associated with a heavier packaging, and the fact that, especially in the US, those sorts of things are not as recyclable either. I mean, aluminum has a good track record, but glass definitely doesn't have a very exhaustive system. It becomes pretty tricky. So I heard a lot about how, consumers or the everyday person really have a role to play in this. I'm wondering if you could leave us with some takeaways of just like what the everyday person can keep in mind next time they're thinking about recycling.
Yeah, for sure. My main suggestion is don't read any of the guides of the states that tell you what you can and can't put in the recycling bin. It's going to vary. So just pay attention to two things, the rigidity of whatever you're trying to throw away, and then the color. So very general rules is if it's rigid, just rinse it and put it in the recycling bin. It's going to get recycled. It's kind of the highest value material. And then on the flexible side, if it is that kind of flexible that holds its shape, and the only thing I could think of here is like the rotisserie chicken bag, that kind of flexible, but that holds its shape, clean that and put in the recycling bin, it's gonna get recycled. Anything cling film like, so it's flexible, but then it can change shape as you play with it, just throw that in the trash can at the moment. That's definitely not something that the market wants. And it's just going to further contaminate the really good stuff that you're putting in the recycling bin. And then on the color side, if it's clear, wash it, put it in the recycling bin every single time. If it's colorful and rigid, put it in the recycling bin every time. But if it's colorful and flexible, odds are the market isn't really going to want to take it, so you can put that in the trash can. So again, just rigidity and color are the two big things to pay attention. And I think that should simplify it to where you're not thinking for more than a couple seconds on whether you should put in your recycling bin or not.
Those are some super easy tips, right? So rigidity and color, and we can go from there. And I really enjoyed this conversation. So thanks so much for helping us understand a little bit more about plastics recycling and be better recycling or sustainability advocates. I'm hoping that everyone feels like sustainability doesn't have to be so complex once we have some experts explain it in simplified terms. And let's try and keep it cool and really help our planet along the way. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Mel.